I recognize the member for Saskatoon-Nutana.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And indeed, I would like to second the motion that was made by my colleague from Regina Rosemont. And it's always a bit of a difficulty for me to get up and speak after him, since he gives such fine remarks and such a thorough review of a lot of the problems that we find in this particular budget that was just presented yesterday here to the House and to the people of Saskatchewan. Just at the outset, I want to thank the Premier for his words. It's always appreciated when those kinds of things are dealt with reasonably. But at this point, I'm going to focus my comments on the budget. It's hard to believe, Mr. Speaker, that this is the fourth budget that I've had the opportunity to speak to. I can't believe how time flies, and I think that's a sign that we're busy in this legislature doing the things that we need to do, and I think certainly as the official opposition, our role, as always, is to shine a light on the activities of this government, on the decisions made by this government, and certainly where our role is to reflect what we're hearing from the voters in our constituencies and certainly the people in Saskatchewan around the province, because we know a lot of people are already contacting our office with respect to concerns about this budget, and I'm going to be addressing a few of those today. Before I start, though, I think it's appropriate for me to give a few thank yous to the people that support me in my position as an MLA for Saskatoon-Nutana. And first up, definitely my CAs. I have had 2 CAs over the course of this year. First of all, Deborah Aiken, who is on maternity leave right now. She's had a young son in November, so she's taking time to be with her son. And in her absence, I have the good fortune of having Mr. Cody Genie keep the office running in my absence, and certainly he's an incredibly capable person who has done a great job for me, and I always know he's got my back, so and Deborah as well. So it's always great when we have these solid constituency assistants who are dedicated to the people in our constituency and certainly to the work that we're doing as MLAs. I also want to thank my provincial executive for my riding, certainly Carrie Schaefer, who's our president, and Tim Hutchinson, who's been a long-standing supporter and contributor to the hard work that we do as our constituency. We just had our annual fundraiser on the weekend. It was an Irish Ceilidh, and we had a lot of fun, Mr. Speaker, and an art auction was a highly successful event. Lots of people came out to join in, and what really made me happy was the number of kids that showed up to dance. We even had the Leader of the Opposition doing the chicken dance with his 2 girls, so that's always a joy to me. Perhaps Mr. Speaker might want to come next year and do the chicken dance with us. He's saying no. So it's really a lot of fun. We do the Virginia Reel, and it's an example of community. Mr. Speaker, don't get me going on the actions for the chicken dance. We do have a good time there, and I think part of the thrill for me is when we have community events where people come of all generations. So we had at our dance, we had some great musicians. We also had some older couples who know the old dances like the polkas and the waltzes, but then we had the younger kids doing their thing too. And then we did a Virginia Reel where, in some places the arch that we used was a little wee person and a great big tall person, and it was just a lot of fun. So I think those kinds of events build community, and certainly I want to thank my executive and the good people from Saskatoon-Nutana and Saskatoon Southeast as well, who were very active and partners in that event. Finally, I just want to say a shout out to my friends, my family, for their support. My 2 boys are thriving these days. My one son, I just found out yesterday, we were talking, he's in Montreal, and he's highly involved in a student protest at the University of Concordia, and so he's planning a student action day of action, and I know he's really engaged in the political process there. He's quite frustrated with the Liberal government of Quebec and their allegiances with the corporate world that he's concerned about. So I'm very proud of him for being political and taking that stand as a young man, because his biggest frustration, Mr. Speaker, is that so many students are not willing to engage in the discussion. They're scared, they're worried, they don't want to affect their studies, and so they're not. He's concerned about the future of democracy if people don't take a stand and stand up for what they believe in. I'm very proud of him. My other son is off to New Zealand these days, and he's now He's now hiking in southern New Zealand and sent some photos last night as well of beautiful terrain. He's enjoying the youth. So I'm so proud of my two boys, and certainly I want to say thank you to my friends as well, and all my family who support. I know my dad just wrote a letter to the Leader Post the other day, the old farmer, and it was a blistering letter, Mr. Speaker, and he still is. He's not pulling any punches. He's very disappointed in the direction that agriculture is going, and he wrote a letter to the editor of the Star Phoenix at 88 that I think is such a good letter. So I'm very proud of my dad and his farm activism as well. So that keeps me going. That's what sort of motivates me to continue to do the work that I do, and that's why, Mr. Speaker, I'm so disappointed in what this government tabled for the people of Saskatchewan yesterday. We've been looking for a number of things, but the three main things I think that we were hoping would be in this budget were this, Mr. Speaker. We're looking for more opportunities for young people, for my children, for them to be able to come back to Saskatchewan and have a career, have a graduate retention program to rely on, all of those things. We were looking for affordability for families, and quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, this budget goes the other way. It makes life way more unaffordable for families, which is really disappointing. We were also calling for dignity and security for seniors. In times of record revenues, Mr. Speaker, we have a government that still fails to recognize the crisis we have in seniors' care. They're not taking it seriously, they're dismissing it, and they're choosing instead to have this wasteful spending on other pet projects. So what do we get? What did we get in yesterday's budget? Well, first of all, we see that this government has no shortage of revenues. The revenues keep coming in. Our non-renewable resource sectors are strong. Agriculture is strong. We know that both grain farmers and producers are doing very well. We know that communities are doing their part and paying their taxes and getting the job done. But what happens when this government gets higher revenues? We don't know. We're saying, where does all this money go? It's certainly not going into the pockets of the families. What do we see here? Families are paying more and they're getting less, Mr. Speaker. And that's really hard for people with young families, for sure. We know that the cost of housing has gone up. We see utility costs going up, Mr. Speaker. We see food costs going up, and yet we see that we now have an income test for the active families benefit. And I mean, that is such a regressive move, and really the active families benefit could have been strengthened and bolstered, but this government chose to do the exact opposite and actually cut it pretty much in half. Having had two boys who were active in soccer and music lessons, Mr. Speaker, I mean, I was always fortunate enough, I guess, in my position to be able to do those after extracurricular activities, but we know there are many, many families who can't. And when you look at the income testing level that this government chose, we're certainly going to have plenty of questions for the minister in committee about how they came to that determination that $60,000 was appropriate. But I think if you look at some of the numbers, when people are trying to pay for their home, trying to keep down two jobs if they're fortunate in their family to be able to have both parents working, paying for childcare, looking after all the needs of their kids, plus trying to get ahead a little bit, and then on top of that having this imposed upon them is a blow. It's nothing less than that, Mr. Speaker, and we're very disappointed in that. What else do we get? We get the walking back of the graduate retention program. As I said already, we're getting calls from concerned people who were reliant on this program and had great need for it to help them get forward. And here we see it now being attached to the income tax program. Many of these students are still seeking positions of employment or gainful employment, and it just seems like a real sort of step backwards that we see in this budget. Now, I guess what the question that this government didn't ask is, what do families really need? What are they looking for? And we've been calling for some of these things. But we see that instead of, we know that there's an infrastructure deficit in hospitals and schools in this province, but instead of dealing with the deficit for the hospitals, there's a $2.2 billion deficit. Right now, we get $27 million for that infrastructure deficit. That's 1/10 of what's required, Mr. Speaker. We've called for, but we did not get any relief for the highest ambulance fees in the country, Mr. Speaker. And that's something that terrifies people with sick children or with sick parents. This is an area that when you look at the overall scale of the budget, this is one area that we can't understand why that this government didn't take a look at it. We presented the case. We had a very strong case presented by some individuals in the province here, but they chose to ignore that. And indeed, with the changes to the employment assistance benefit, we know that families that are being cut off from that are also going to be cut off from the coverage for ambulance services. So anyone with health issues, with children who are dealing with serious health issues, complex health issues, that's going to be a real step backwards. What else do families need? Well, we were asking for a simple one, more staff in senior care homes. We know what the deficit is. We continually see this government refusing to even put in minimum care standards and regulate them, because we know that they just don't want to deal with the deficit that exists in staffing. The urgent needs. We talk a lot about the urgent needs that the healthcare regions have identified in long-term care homes, number of physical aids that are required, or lifts and things like that, and also, of course, care aids, Mr. Speaker. And so the failure to actually take these problems and address them head-on is very concerning, and I think we use the expression head in the sand, but it really is appropriate in this case, because we don't think this government is taking it seriously. Another thing we've been calling for and we don't see is any reduction in class sizes, or sort of a maximum cap on class sizes. School boards are struggling with this, families are struggling with this, teachers are struggling with this, and with the complexities and the intensification of issues that the Leader of the Opposition raised today in terms of English as an additional language and other complex needs of today's student bodies. Mr. Speaker, this is a problem, and this is something that we will continue to press this government on and shine a light on, because they need to take it seriously. And I think at this point they're just too happy to push it onto the school boards. The school boards are starting to push back, Mr. Speaker. I mean, generally we understand school boards need to be appreciative of what government does, but at some point, I think we've already started to see the breaking point for some school boards, and when they actually speak out, I think that's something, Mr. Speaker, and I really wish this government would take note of that and acknowledge it and realize what it takes for a school board to actually do that. I have so many people come to me and say, I'd love to say something, but I can't, because I'm worried about my job, I'm worried about the repercussions, and this is not an uncommon comment that I get, Mr. Speaker. Another issue that we talk about, and we've been asking, this is for many years now, is an increase in EAs. And I know there was some talk today about numbers on how those are happening, but it's the funding for the EAs that I think is still not sufficient and needs to be addressed seriously. What else do families need? More childcare spaces, Mr. Speaker, and again we see a stepping back and a pedaling back in this budget of the need for creating those spaces and making sure that there are staff that are available to actually work in those childcare spaces. The wage levels for childcare workers is abysmal, and when we think that we're putting our most precious thing in daycare, our children, the most precious commodity we have, and we have situations where we can't get people to work in daycares, there's a problem, and I think that's it's an issue of prioritization of values, and we see the misplaced priorities that this government has. We do see some stuff in this budget that we will continue to bring to the attention of the Assembly, and that's under the heading I have of wasteful spending. So this is the misplaced priorities that we've been talking about, Mr. Speaker, and obviously top of our list is the whole John Black Lean program, where we have this American consultant who's coming in and imposing theology basically on the healthcare system that so many people have said this is not working, this is not right, and the waste is incredible. We know we have a bloated administration in our healthcare system. We need that addressed, but this government is unable to take care of that problem. We have consultants charging more than $120 million a year, and no record on the part of this government as to what the work is. Mr. Speaker, I did a Freedom of Information request on one consultant that comes out of Regina here. They've done more than 30 $35 million of work for this government over the last 7 years. That's a lot of money. It's almost as much as the John Black Lean contract. And every request for information that I got, they blacked out the statement of work that this company is doing. So we have no idea what this company is doing. We know that they got $35 million to do it, but it's really difficult as a member of the public to not be able to access exactly what the contract was and why we're spending $35 million for one company, one contractor here in Regina. There's the ambulance. Oh, sorry, I've already talked about that one. The P3 rent-a-school scheme. I mean, again, we've highlighted in this assembly the difficulties with that kind of process. And what concerns me most, having two young adult sons, is the fact that the debt that this government is incurring as a result of these P3 schemes, the debt will be as much as the cost of the schools themselves by the time it's all done, because they're pushing it off for 30 years. So who's going to be dealing with this debt problem? It won't be us. It'll be our children. This is a generational form of debt, Mr. Speaker, and I think for a government that has as much money as this government has, record revenues, the most revenues of any budget in the history of our province, and yet they're still needing to punt debt into the future on my children's backs. I don't appreciate that, Mr. Speaker, and I think a lot of people are going to find it very disturbing. We can't get accountability on the process. We don't know what SaskBuilds is up to. It's kind of a mystery right now. I think they're floundering in terms of trying to get a plan together. We hear about these 9 schools, but and certainly those are schools that were imposed on the communities. There wasn't any consultation with the school boards, and so there's a lot of concerns there about this whole scheme. Further to that, and something that my colleague from Regina Rosemont has raised in the House, and in fact we've introduced legislation to deal with that, is the procurement policy that this government is adhering to right now. The one small example I can give of how this isn't working is some colleagues of mine or friends of mine in the Big River area who have been doing tree planting and reforestation in the Big River area, which, on a side note, reforestation was cut this year yesterday, and there were some young journalists here who were very concerned about that. But reforestation, as it is now being the tendering policy, the procurement policy is such that large mega tree planting companies are coming in and getting these contracts because they can lowball the price. But what we're not getting is sort of that care and attention, and I think the local flavour that my friend's company brings to the table. And I think my colleague from Regina Rosemont has indicated that on a number of occasions, and certainly when we speak to that bill, we want transparency, and we want that clarity of where's the fairness. How do we ensure that the local people are getting jobs and that we're protecting the folks from Saskatchewan as much as we are ensuring that the government is getting a good deal? It's not just about the bottom line, Mr. Speaker, and that's the flaw in this policy. I think for me the biggest concern, and this is one that may not get as much attention in the public because it deals with understanding the provincial finances. And certainly when I look at the budget and now with the change this year, I'm just barely keeping above water when I try to figure out exactly what all these numbers mean. But what I do understand, Mr. Speaker, is that in spite of the shortage of almost $700 million this year from oil and gas revenues, this government has chosen to go into debt to the tune of $700 million just in its general operations for the future. And that is something that really worries me. How can it be that we have a government whose revenues have doubled in the last few years that cannot put money away, a government that drains the rainy day fund, a government, I think it's called the Growth and Financial Security Fund. This is a government that is spending like drunken sailors, Mr. Speaker, and yet they're putting us further into debt. And I think what I want to share right now is just a blast from the past. I'm going to get my colleague to, maybe not, he has to unlock it. So I'm going to want to share something that's in the Canadian Encyclopedia, but I will save that for a few minutes down the road. Sure. But I don't want to forget, so I'll remember to do that. Anyways, back to borrowing $700 million. That's what reminds me of. What's that? Okay, that's John's. The next step, I guess I want to mention in terms of numbers, was the Growth and Financial Security Fund. This is again, in a time of record revenues, we see this government still taking from the Growth and Financial Security Fund. It was $1.35 billion at its height, and it's now down to $200 million. What's going on, Mr. Speaker? Again, this government has record revenues, and they're draining the Growth and Financial Security Fund. We see them pulling out the sale of a privatization of our crowns. We have the privatization of Information Services Corporation, a corporation that was making good money for the taxpayers of Saskatchewan, paying into the general revenue. That revenue's gone now, and now they're taking the $107 million, I think it is, from that sale and using the privatization proceeds to manage their affairs. That's not what we need to see from a government with record revenues. And we see the comments today in response to the budget from the potash corporations about their plan to take the money now and instead of in the future. I mean, so they're grabbing money that should be saved for the future, and they're spending money now that will be debt in the future. And I don't think that shows any signs of a responsible government. And I'm sure there's people are going to start asking questions about this, and they already have on some of the programs. But on the larger scheme, I mean, we can't hide the fact that there's debt. And it's the silliness of the Minister of Finance smiling and proudly pronouncing that this is a balanced budget. The ridiculousness of it is beyond belief, Mr. Speaker. But I mean, the people are paying attention. People are watching this, and they're starting to wonder where the money is going. Just to speak specifically on a couple of my areas of responsibility as a critic, I just want to talk a little bit about the environment, Mr. Speaker. In this budget alone, we see a 6.3% cut in climate change, and of course that's added up to the 82% overall. And earlier today, I asked the Minister of the Environment, and we know that one of the new Sask Party candidates has printed an article about calling climate change witchcraft reasoning, and I think that kind of language has got to be alarming to a lot of people in Saskatchewan who see the changes not only here in the province as a result of global warming, but also around the world. And when we see cities like Sao Paulo and Brazil, 2 million people with no fresh water, with the state of California and Phoenix, Arizona, and Las Vegas, all dealing with no water, not a shortage of water, but no water in the very near future. These are things that people are paying attention to. And when we see this kind of response from this government, there's concerns. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that's something that as the environment critic, I do get a lot of comments on. We know that total spending on climate change since 2009 was $64 million. Is about 4% of the cost of the CCS project. And we know, Mr. Speaker, the CCS project is only going to deal with less than 2% of the emissions that this province produces. There's nothing else on the table, Mr. Speaker. In terms of environmental protection, I mean, the minister spoke the other day about how robust that program was. It's down 30% this year, $1.7 million, and it's now only $34 million, and it was $40 million in 2009. So we see a cut of $6 million just in environmental protection alone, Mr. Speaker. In 2009, the total expenses for the ministry was $200 million. It's now $162 million. So we see a cut of $40 million overall from the budget. In 2009, staff was over 1,000. It's now down to 866. So it's about a 15% cut in staff. We see no change or chapter for the climate change part of the new environmental code, something that I think 3 or 4 ministers have been working on since this government came into power. We still don't see the chapter on climate change. We see no strategy for dealing with the serious drainage issues that I get calls on from across the province. So the only question we have left for this approach to the environment, Mr. Speaker, is where did the money go? If they have so much money, why are they cutting $40 million from this particular ministry's budget? We don't know where it is. In tourism, we see a cut of 11% in the fairly small tourism budget. It's down $1.73 million, and it was at $16.172 million. It's now down to $14.442 million. Only question I have, Mr. Speaker, is where did the money go? They have record revenues, but we're still seeing cuts to areas like environment, tourism, also parks, culture and sport. We see a number of small cuts, and I think some pundits were referring to this as a budget of a death by 1,000 cuts. Well, here we have a cut to the Provincial Capital Commission of $145,000, down 5%. We also know there's no further money for the Meewasin Valley Authority. And Mr. Speaker, that's something where this government has completely dropped the ball. We see a beautiful part of Saskatchewan, an urban park in Saskatchewan that has been basically left in the lurch by this government. And we see the City of Saskatoon stepping up to the plate. We've seen some federal funding, but the value for the dollar that organization receives means they have to really shut down some of their operations and stop providing the services to the citizens of Saskatchewan that take advantage of that beautiful urban park. We see the Community Infrastructure Fund being cut by 70%, Mr. Speaker. That's something that communities have relied on to build in their communities, and it's 70% cut seems pretty harsh when you have record revenues. I've talked a bit earlier about the Active Families Benefit cut of approximately $6 million. That's half of the people that were taking advantage of this cut or this tax break in order to make sure that their kids are getting the activity that they need and the cultural training that they need. Mr. Speaker, I do a lot of shows around the province with old-time music, and every time we go to these schools, we ask the kids, how many of you want to learn these instruments? And of course they all want to learn the instruments, but when afterwards we ask, is there anyone teaching in this area this kind of music or any kind of music, we find out that there just isn't enough instructors and people available to teach. So that's a sad thing, and if there's no demand for lessons, then we'll have less and less teachers as well. It's kind of like a vicious circle. We're ever hopeful. I guess maybe we're optimists, but we were really hoping to see the reinstatement of the film employment tax credit. It's kind of painful this year because we see the completion of the film employment tax credit in the budget. It's now 100% gone. And so is our film industry, Mr. Speaker. We have a lot of people doing very good work in the province, but in terms of an industry, it's been decimated. And we're still hopeful at some point this government will see reason, and this the new tax rebate for manufacturers and export remains to be seen, and we'll certainly have questions for the minister and his staff on how this new rebate will help out the creative industries. We know that most creative industries don't even have full-time employees, but rather they're contractors. They work on multiple projects per year, and certainly individual artists and musicians don't have staff. So we're not exactly sure how that's going to help the folks in the creative industries. Again, with all these cuts to park, culture and sport, and the fact that we have record revenues and cuts to all these line ministries, Mr. Speaker, I'm left with one question. Where did the money go? Same with agriculture. We're going to look at agriculture. We see a number of cuts to crop insurance premiums, so I know part of that is explained by the fact that premiums are lower, so that will help producers. But also agri-stability is down 6.4%. Again, the minister and his staff have explained that that's in relation to an evening out of the federal funding that goes along with agri-stability. But even yesterday in the Rotunda, Mr. Speaker, I was speaking to a farmer who's concerned about agri-stability and the confusion around that. Nobody really knows what's going on. So those are issues, I think, over and above the actual budgetary lines that we see in the budget itself. But in terms of agriculture, again, in 2007-08, there were 518 full-time equivalents in that ministry. This year, 392, a 25% cut in the services and the programs that have been provided to the people of Saskatchewan in the agriculture area. So again, we have record revenues, but we see a 25% cut in the number of public servants that are providing services to the people. So with record revenues and all these cuts, where did the money go? We have to keep asking that question. We see a steady, gradual erosion, Mr. Speaker, of programs, services, staff. Where has the money gone? This government is going to spend a record amount of money this year, more than any other year, but families aren't feeling the love, Mr. Speaker. we know this is one of the concerns we see. We know this government could choose to do the right thing. They could choose to fix seniors' care. They could choose to legislate and deal with the number of children in classrooms and make sure that the classroom sizes are responsible and reasonable and allow for learning. We know that they could choose to make life more affordable, but the sad part of it, Mr. Speaker, is that they choose not to. They have record revenues. They choose to go into further debt, and that's something I think that's very disappointing. Perhaps electioneering. I know there's some comment in the pundits again today about whether or not is this an election budget, and so when we see this massive amount of infrastructure spending this year as a result of debt, people aren't going to see the debt. They're going to see the activity and think, oh, isn't this great? But I think people also know that when we have debt, it's going to bind the hands of our kids and our kids' generation, and that's what concerns me about all of this punting of debt, Mr. Speaker. We see a government that decides to keep spending on their favourite pet projects, and as a result, Saskatchewan families need to dig deeper in their own pockets for housing, for utilities, for seniors need to now make decisions regarding whether or not their medications should be purchased or whether they should buy food, because again, the threshold for the seniors drug plan has been drastically lowered. Parents need to decide whether or not their kids can go into the sports programs that their children are interested in because of, again, an arbitrary limit placed on families of $60,000. So there's certainly it's a disappointing budget, Mr. Speaker, despite the fact that we are doing so well as a province. We don't see people doing well, we don't see families doing well, we don't see seniors doing well, we don't see students doing well. So I think, again, and I know we say it a lot, but I think we have to keep asking this question, Mr. Speaker, where has the money gone? And so as a result of that, I'm very honoured to be able to second the motion that my colleague made, and I would like to adjourn debate at this time.
No.
I just conclude my remark, Speaker. Thank you very much.